Hey guys, in this video, we're going to be talking about triggering animations in Drift Timeline. So this has to obviously do with Drift Pro. So all of these settings are just for Drift Pro in the Drift Timeline stack. So Drift Timeline has three different ways that you can trigger an animation timeline, either on scroll, click, and hover. So to keep things simple, let's go ahead and first start off with the hover animations. So when you enable hover, you'll notice that there's a whole section here at the bottom just for hover animations. So here we define the class of the element we want to hover over in order to trigger the animation. Now, this could be your element itself. It could be something completely different. In this particular case, I have a green container, which is this green box that we're going to be animating. And whenever I hover over its parent container, in this case, the class demo1, I want the animation to trigger. So here, when I hover over demo1, it's going to trigger my timeline. And this particular timeline, it's simple. All it is animating the one single box on the page. But this could trigger an entire timeline of animations. Again, here I set in my hover class, and whenever I hover over that particular element, it's going to trigger my animation. Now, what's it going to do? So in Drift Timeline, we have multiple options here. We can say on enter, we want to pause, resume, restart, reverse. Chances are you're going to want to do play. Now on leave, the default is going to be reverse. So when you unhover from something, it's going to reverse that animation. But let's say you want that to potentially be none. So at that point, when you hover over, maybe it'll do the animation, but not reverse on hover out. Let's see that in action. So when I hover anywhere over this container, it triggers the animation. And when I hover out, it reverses that animation. Now, if I set the on leave to none, we go ahead and when we hover over, it'll animate. And when I unhover, it does nothing. Now, the last setting here has to do with touch devices and how the animation is triggered. Since touch doesn't have mice, we have to figure out what do we want to do with tapping or touching our devices. So by default, it's just a single tap will trigger an animation. However, with this checkbox, you can actually tap and hold will trigger the animation. And then once you take your finger off, that will trigger the on leave event. Okay, so let's move on to our click-based animation, our click-based triggers. Now, if you notice in the Drift Pro demos, there is some control buttons here. And if we can use these control buttons to control our animation. Here we have three. We have a smart play pause, which will allow you to either play, pause based on the state of the animation, and allows you to also go directly to reset the animation or go to the end of the animation. So, but there are a lot more controls here, and let's look at those inside of the stack settings. So if we look inside of our Drift Timeline and you click on the Drift Timeline options, you'll notice that there is a click actions settings group here. And this click actions, you'll notice that there are a lot of actions here. So there's smart play, which gives us the either play it if it's paused, pause it if it's playing, stuff like that. Then we have a straight play button that we can use, a straight pause button, a restart animation, resume, reverse, toggle, seek. That allows us to seek to a particular position, as well as reset and end. Now, in this one example, I'm only using smart play, reset, and end. So what I've done here is you see that I have little classes defined in here. And all you need to do in our example here, I have three buttons. And all you need to do is place those classes inside of a button. And it doesn't need to be just a button. You can actually put these classes anywhere you want. It could be an image, it could be a piece of text, whatever. And then if that class is clicked, it will trigger that action for that animation. So in this case, I have this button that is the Smart Play button. It has the Smart Play class. I have the reset button as well as the end button. Now, you can customize these classes to be whatever you want. So if you have multiple instances on your page, you can change these if you wanted to make sure that buttons aren't triggering multiple things. Now, if you do have a button that you want to trigger multiple animations, you can do that. Just have multiple timelines watching the same class, and you can actually trigger multiple animation timelines at once with a click of a button. Now, this is the demo file that ships with Drift Pro. And if you want to have a little play, you'll see that inside this demo, I have this little toggle controls. This itself is a drift stack that is using click and hover events. You'll notice that when I click on this toggle up here, it brings down the controls. When I hover out of the entire box, everything hides. So this uses both click and hover events as well. I'm not going to dive into the exact implementation here to kind of show you all the tricks, but you can actually view this yourself in the Drift Pro demo file and see exactly how it was done. This drift timeline stack is by default inside of the site styles partial that is used inside this project. Okay, so now let's look at the scroll-based animations inside Drift Timeline. When you enable these scroll-based settings, you'll notice that there are a bunch of settings that get shown. The first here is the trigger selector. Now, what is that? This is the actual element that you want to base your trigger off of. So in this case, just as before, we are animating this green square, but I want to use this container that contains a class of demo1 as my home base for where to trigger the animations. I want to trigger the animation when this particular box scrolls into the view. So that's why I'm going to set the trigger selector to be demo1, because that is the class of the element that I want to trigger my animation. Now we're going to skip over this scrub timeline for right now, and we'll come back to that later. Now, next up is the scroll trigger positions. This allows us to configure exactly where our trigger positions are going to be on scroll. And when our actual trigger selector crosses those elements, the last set of settings are what actions are taken. So on enter, we're playing. On leave, we're going to pause. On enter back, we're going to resume. And on leave back, we're going to reset. Okay, so what does all that mean? Okay, so let's go into preview. So in order to demonstrate this a little bit better so we can see everything, I've set the end position and the start position to be 100 pixels. I've also adjusted these trigger actions to be something a little bit more exciting. So we're playing, reversing, playing, and reversing. Let's see those in action. Okay, so I'm starting over. As I scroll on the page, we'll see that once my start reaches the start point, our animation begins. And we can scroll, keep scrolling. Once the end reaches the end, the on leave action happens, which is reverse. And that happens, our animation reversed. Now, as I come back, as end crosses back below the end, we have on enter back. And here I have play. So then the animation happens again. And as I keep scrolling, once this start crosses the start going down, we're going to have on leave back. And that is reverse. And there we go. So as you see, they're very detailed settings, but it gives us a lot of flexibility with what we can do and how we can trigger our animations. Now, one setting that I skipped over before is this scrub timeline on scroll. And what is that? Now, actually, before I turn that on, you've noticed that every time we've actually ran this animation and, we cross one of these points, the entire animation happens. However, what if we want our animation to actually track our scrolling speed? So when we scrub the timeline, what that's going to do is our timeline is actually no longer time-based. It all happens based on our tracking speed of scroll. The faster I scroll, the animation just follows the tracking of the web page. The animation starts when I hit the start, and the animation ends when the end reaches the end point. So that is how scrubbing works. Now, in order to make this a little bit more interesting, we also have inertia. Now, to show you what this allows the animation to continue past the point where I'm scrolling. So as I scroll down the page, you'll notice that when I stop scrolling, the animation is still going. This allows us to add some life to our web pages so that animations are still continuing even though I stopped scrolling. This can give you some very amazing parallax effects that I'm sure you've seen all across the web. So that kind of rounds us off for the Drift Pro /timeline trigger options. Make sure you check out the rest of the wonderful tutorial videos we have on Drift and Drift Pro.